Okay, so thanks for coming to Optimizing Translations in AEM for Enhanced Regional Trust and Partnership. This is going to be a content supply chain story. It's going to go across a few platforms, involve a few third-party tools, and we're going to get really deep into the how. So feel free to put questions in chat. Happy to dig into any of it. I've tested it all. I've gone through the UIs. I can tell you soup to nuts how it works. So about us, why women in tech, inclusive networks generate revenue, they foster innovation, and they inspire the next generation to build on. I think DE&I is really important. I think you can't really objectively hear someone until you've placed them in the appropriate cultural context. And so when we build inclusive networks, we foster innovation much more quickly because it increases that communication and that understanding. And so Nidhi couldn't make it today. You're stuck with me, but she is my better half, and she is a certified AEM architect and DevOps, as well as a wonderful human being. So next time, hopefully she'll make it. In the meantime, we're going to jump right into a user journey. So let me set the table. Catalina is not a client. She is not a real person. I made her up. She is a character, and we're going to follow her through her story so that we can learn more about kind of not just how the tools work, but what do the conversations sound like when you enable the tools and the full functionality. So first, imagine that Catalina is new to her role and she's looking for quick wins in the first 90 days. So what she wants to do is enhance regional stakeholder trust through improved translations capabilities and supporting review processes. So that is increasing velocity, it's increasing trust, and we're doing that through autonomy and better communication. So currently, she's only got a global style guide to work with. Regional stakeholders need to negotiate for it to adapt their messaging to local regulations. Vendors aren't receiving a glossary of terminology. They're not held to an SLA. And when we see this, we generally see translations review timelines expressed as a range. So you'll get your translations live in 8 to 12 weeks instead of in 5 days, business days, right? And when we provide vendors with a glossary of terminology, it helps them move more quickly. So furthermore, translations requests are handled through Workfront, but there is no proactive resourcing planning against historical data. So when we analyze historical data, when we analyze content velocity, it allows us to align bottleneck resources appropriately so that higher value pieces of content get higher value resourcing and move through the pipeline more quickly to realize that value more quickly for the organization and compound on it over time. So as a result of all of these kind of, let's call them issues, there's an increased churn in email communications. It slows content velocity in the translations pipeline and decreases trust between stakeholders overall. So the problem statement is, how do we increase content velocity for translations by applying content supply chain techniques and tools, and then moving those processes through more quickly. So we're going to do it with Adobe products, believe it or not. And we're not just focused on AEM, right? We really want to make sure we do this in a data-intensive way. So that's going to rely on customer journey analytics, Workfront, et cetera, in order to use AEM in the most impactful way to the content supply chain overall. So the first thing she's going to do is she's going to look at her historic data within Workfront, and she's going to draft an SLA. This is between Catalina's translations team and the lines of business she serves and her regional stakeholders. So the way you do this is you're going to look at your historic data by project type. So let's say landing page, right? Let's say she sees that landing pages typically take 5 business days based on Workfront data. Do not get ambitious. This is where you're establishing trust, right? So you're going to go back, you're going to say, hey, 90% of the time, we're going to stand up a landing page in 5 days. Just start with that. Over deliver after the SLA is established. So then you're going to start with your biweekly reporting to your stakeholders. And we're going to use a centralized Tableau dashboard for internal unified reporting metrics. Now, let me talk about how those are going to be slightly different, but really important to stabilizing the process up front. So SLA negotiation. We already went through the first bullet, but the next part is about reporting out on a regular cadence and really holding yourself accountable for any kind of thing that misses the deadline. So you're going to do a really rigorous root cause analysis, and you're going to report against yourself. So this is really critical because consistency leads to trust, trust leads to respect, respect leads to partnership, right? In order to get to that partnership, you have to start with consistency, and that involves accountability and integrity. So I'm going to show you the dashboard in a moment, but here's what's critical is there's going to be a point where that consistency becomes very relied upon, and your content volume is going to grow. It always happens this way. The content volume is going to grow because the line of business can rely on you for that. There's going to be a point where you start to regularly miss the mark because the volume is just too big for your team. And that is when you go back to the business and say, I need more time. You're going to renegotiate the SLA to be longer. The business will most likely push back on you and say, no, I still need the landing page in 5 business days. And that is your inflection point where you ask for chargeback billing. If you warm your lines of business up to the conversation this way, where you're warming them up, you're getting that consistency, so you're getting that trust, you've already persuaded them that this is valuable by the time you get to the chargeback billing conversation. This is a lot more fruitful than having your executives kind of go and talk to each other about chargeback billing model from a standpoint of being cold. So what does that kind of reporting dashboard look like? It's not beautiful, but it can look like this. So we have our SLA percentage on the bar chart across the top with a trend line. You've got your RCA table underneath it. And then you've got project status overall with a number of tasks. Now, why does this matter? Um, it's because you see how it says yellow for overall ability to meet SLA, yellow for team capacity, and red for velocity of requests. That's not bad. This is what the inflection point looks like when you can ask for chargeback billing, because you can see the trend lines going up and then suddenly in January they miss, right? But you can see the change over month has gone up. You've had their buy-in. You've gotten that kind of reporting down pat. Now, there's another aspect to reporting that's really valuable, and that is internal reporting with Tableau. So when we use the Workfront API and we pull Tableau, we pull those endpoints into Tableau, this creates a really powerful internal report that leadership checks because it's always on. Leadership's used to Tableau, they're already checking it. And it's going to show kind of your daily stand-up for content. Um, and it's also going to show an escalation list. Now, this is really critical, right? Because it's automatically going to report on escalation lists. So if you have a lot of repeat offenders, it's going to show, and it's the system will just work, and the repeat offenders will appear, and leadership will see it, and those are conversations that are much easier to have because again, you're doing it in a way that warms people up to the conversation. You're not just going in cold and saying, this is late again, right? So that's what we want to do. We want to control the conversation as much as possible and make sure that we're persuading with multiple channels. So back to Catalina. So Catalina is now going to come up with a glossary of terminology because she's got her SLA with the lines of business, right? She knows she can make 5 business days 90% of the time or more often. Now she's going to go back to her vendor who provides her the translations and renegotiate the SLA with them to be more stringent. One of the levers she's going to pull is by providing them with a glossary of terminology to say, hey, I think you can make it more quickly now that I've given you this resource, et cetera, et cetera. So the way she's going to pull that glossary of terminology, there's 2 ways to do it. One, if you have permission from your organization, you can scrape the front end of the sites with Python and then upload the content into an LLM. You can also just use an LLM. It depends on your knowledge cutoff date for the LLM you're allowed to use. So again, she's got the SLA with the business, 5 days, 90%. Now she's going to go back to that vendor and say, I need it from you in like 2 or 3, right? And I need it like 95% of the time. That's going to give her that margin for error that keeps that RCA table really clean and hopefully empty. So Python web scrapers and GenAI analysis. Scrapy is one of my favorite web crawling and scraping frameworks. It's very simple to set up, and it will deposit the copy into a CSV file for you. You don't necessarily need it. So if your knowledge cutoff date, like the knowledge cutoff date for GPT-4 is December 2023. GPT-4 is trained up to that date. So if you haven't released a ton of new products and a ton of new terminology since then, this prompt in the lower right will get you 60 to 70% of the way there, right? And then you circulate the glossary of terminology with your SMEs, say, does this look right? Am I missing anything? It's about reducing manual work. It's not a substitute. So that is there. So going into Catalina. So this is where Catalina has reached her inflection point on chargeback billing. And so she's asked the line of business for chargeback billing, and they've said yes. And so now she needs to use Workfront to support the chargeback billing model. And she's like, what do I charge, right? And so she's come up with this model. And because she's aligned it to project type, and project type is aligned to project timelines and Workfront, et cetera, this becomes a lot cleaner for reporting overall when you go by category. So the landing page project for 5 days, let's say we looked at our creative expenses using survey data, and we're going to assume there's a blended rate of like 87,000 per resource. Let's say each resource gets about 3 weeks of PTO a year. And then we're going to say, okay, that gives us a total annual billable hours of, about 8,700, total expenses about 260,000. Let's say that a landing page for 5 days, let's say it costs 1,200. And again, it's hard to get those cost centers from lines of business and exchange value that way, but you're really trying to find creative ways to show the lines of business and hold them to the value of your team. And even if the $1,200 somehow becomes nominal or just like a reportable metric, it still helps you do that comparison that shows the worth of your team overall. So we're going into, so the English version is ready for translations. This is kind of jumping around in the story a little bit, so I apologize for that. But basically, Catalina's authoring team has stood up the new content in Language Masters and AEM. So now Catalina has renegotiated the machine translations contract with her vendor. And she did it using data analysis with Python. Machine translations was the lowest cost option for the type of content that she wanted to do. So this is really important. There's 2 points on the next 2 slides that support this. The first I already showed at Skill Exchange in November, but I'm going to repeat it to kind of set the section up, which is that there's no one right type of translations for all content, right? So the way I like to think about it is timeline and cost. So if the content that you're trying to translate is explicit, if it's literal, if it's repetitious, stick with machine translations. It's your cheapest option. So like, for example, if the paint color is blue, stick with machine translations because it will always come back with blue, right? If you run that color through an LLM, a Gen AI tool, it'll say blue sometimes, it'll say azure, another time it'll say navy, and a third time. And then your reviewers are going to have to go back and change it back to blue, which causes churn in your review process and increases your cycles overall. So if the word you're translating is always going to be the same word every time, machine translations. If the content is ambiguous, if it's nuanced, if it's unique, human in the loop plus Gen AI is cost effective because you're not adding time to your timeline, you're not adding bloat to your overall translations timeline. So now I'm going to get into data analysis and machine translations. This is like a cool thing you can do to keep in your back pocket ahead of going into translations negotiation. And it's going to give you a little bit of extra leverage in that conversation. And that looks like this. So we're going to use several Python libraries. So rely, on your IT department to help you with this. But basically what you want to do is you want to know the total number of words, the textual pattern and complexity, repetition, things like that. And that's going to help you kind of predict out what it's going to cost to go from English to Great British English or English to Spanish. And you can start to get ahead of the conversation and say, machine translations up front, we're expecting our cost of English to Spanish to be X, but that cost is going to go down over time because let's say 90% of the updates we make are to, the same set of words every time. So the machine translations is going to hold that memory and you're only going to be charged per the net new word. So upfront cost, low cost, long-term, low maintenance cost. What's cool about that is that it allows you to predict your translations budgets long term. So machine translations, you're going to predict out that upfront cost using this analysis. And then you're going to say long term, we're expecting it to be, let's say $1,000, right? You can also use census data to predict out languages that are growing in popularity in your region. So, right now we're expecting the translations budget to be flat, but we're seeing growth in this language in our population. Let's say a lot of growth for like Spanish. So we're going to add Spanish in a year when we reach that critical inflection point in our region where it becomes necessary and important to translate content to those users. So you start to predict out your content translations budget based off of demographic movement as well. All right, so translations projects in AEM. So Catalina is going to use translations projects to assign content to reviewers. Now within this UI, you can choose your provider for the content, and you can use workflows and export language uh, to those translators automatically. If she wants to test, say, a new human in the loop plus Gen AI vendor, and she doesn't want to set up the connection until she's fully vetted them, you can also export language content as compressed zip files and then import them and map them as well. So translations projects look like this. Your reviewers can be assigned within AEM and given a due date to return edits to authors by. It's also possible for those reviewers to annotate AEM pages within the system, but you also have to remember that Workfront's going to be your master system of record for marketing most likely, so you should track the work in parallel in Workfront, and then you'll have to work through like the most efficient way to manage that process. Okay. So she's used translations projects in AEM. She's assigned it out to reviewers, or reviewers approve the machine translations. Content is live in the system. But the compressed files to the vendor have not been returned yet. So we want to look at what that translations workflow looks like. So that is, you're going to start with language masters. You're going to send those translations to your translations project. It's going to export the content, import it, and then accept the translation and promote launch to what's called a language copy. So the zip files are going to come back. She's going to import them into AEM. And then there are automatic translations approvals and launch that are embedded in the advanced part of translations project properties. So if you're going to review the content outside of AEM, you can then import it into AEM and automatically promote it to launch on acceptance from the vendor. So that's going to allow you to skip this review step within AEM and just automatically publish it on import. So now we've got our whole system really humming, right? We've got our SLAs with the LOBs. They're doing chargeback billing. We're doing a really great SLA with the vendor. Everyone's making their time on time every time. And Catalina wants to see if she can go even faster. So she's going to do a content velocity report in Workfront because what she wants to see is, can she boost velocity for those parts of the site that matter most to her highest lifetime value customers. And so, if you dabble in analytics as I do, you know that when you're customizing your data layer, right, you want to customize the parts of the data layer that are most valuable to the journey to your highest LTV customers. So you're going to do it at the section, component, as well as page level. And so she knows from analytics which content gets the most attention from those customers, and she's going to start to look at velocity to see, how do I move those pieces of content through the system more quickly. So the way I like to calculate content velocity is efficiency, cycle time, and throughput. Now you can do this out of the box in Workfront. It's a really great dashboard, super simple, but what you're looking for is to get that task efficiency score up and the cycle time down. You want that throughput to be higher. Everyone talks about content velocity. I like to measure it. This is how I like to measure it. And so she's got that, right? So now she wants to say, okay, how do I improve regional autonomy even further? And she's going to do that with a localized style guide. So regions are going to respond to content differently. For example, APAC tends to run about 10 years ahead of the world on mobile adoption, right? They were using QR codes on their desktops 10, 15 years ago before they reached kind of critical mass everywhere else. People in EMEA tend to be a little bit more focused on privacy and data, right? So we want to, and those are broad generalizations, so please forgive that. But you want to make sure that you're creating localized style guides because it improves conversion in those regions to meet the needs of the geography. And so one way we're going to do that is with this. So this is like a style guide blueprint, right? It's just illustrative to give you kind of ideas of common categories across style guides. But basically, you want your key takeaway to be this. It doesn't have to be this on day one, right? One of the most important things about onboarding regions to a common system is about making sure that you're training your stakeholders to make time in their day for this, right? You're onboarding, you're warming people up to the conversation slowly. And so you don't have to give them like half of it and say, and throw it over the fence and expect that to land, right? You should give them like, okay, let's talk about inclusions and exclusions from a regulatory standpoint first. Okay, now let's talk about how brand personas may be different. You're going to invest in different parts of the style guide and regionalize them in a phased manner. And the goal is to start with your priority regions, phase in localized elements, and streamline and document that communication in order to improve autonomy and ultimately conversion. So when we talk about parts of the style guide that impact brand recognition and conversion positively when they're globalized, right? That's your logos, that's your brand name, that's your introduction, mission, history, values. Those are visual elements like logo and color palettes, right? But when we get into typography, your Japanese typography, your Cyrillic typography, that's all going to be different typography, right? It doesn't benefit you to use the same fonts across all regions. Um, okay, so going into, okay, so the CJA data proves that the localized style guide has improved engagement and conversion, and so she's going to start to roll out the style guide to additional regions as well. And that is the full presentation. So Q&A. Also, real quick plug, there are multiple Women in Tech analytics, and Women in Tech user groups now. Analytics, Deb is going to do crafting impactful data stories later this month. Courtney is going to do getting started with AI and Marketo in February. And then AEM is going to do some metadata on AEM assets in March. More to come soon. All right, are there any questions? Yes, I'll send out the recording to everyone on the call. All right, I'm going to wait a few minutes to see if there's any questions. If not, I will give you back some time to your day. And thank you all so much for coming. Thanks, Greg, for the comment in chat. Thanks for coming. And I think that's it. Hope to see you in March. Hope to see you at Deb's event in January and Courtney's in February.